give them to a private corporation, the Sea Alaska Corporation.
Which is why we're really talking about this right now. I mean, I wanted people to understand where it was, and what its real intrinsic value is. Because it seems like a no-brainer, even if you're not a tree hugger, that here we've got one of the last remaining places on Earth that really has this value. But there's a bill up, and Matt, are you the best person to talk to about the bill that's been introduced?
I can give you an overview of it. Essentially, the Sea Alaska Corporation was created by the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and they got a certain land entitlement as part of the settlement in 1971, and they've received about 80% of their land, and they've heavily logged the good forested portion of it. They've only got about 2 years of timber supply left. Sea Alaska's been largely a timber corporation for its entire life, and all of a sudden they're looking at the end and they're going, gee, we only got 2 years of trees left, and we have 20% more land that's due us under the act, but it doesn't have very many good trees on it. What are we going to do? And they went to Congress and said, gee, can you give us some more good stuff? That's essentially what the bill is all about. And as we've described, you know, there's many conflicting values that those trees represent. Even natives in who live in Southeast Alaska and who hunt and fish and live their traditional lives, they depend on that intact forest to support the fish and wildlife that they use to sustain their traditional culture, and yet they have their own corporation that wants to go in there and pretty heavily log all that stuff to make money. So it's a difficult situation. I can certainly understand why Sea Alaska might ask for a better deal than they got in the 1971 land claim settlement. Not entirely clear to me why Congress would want to give it to them.
Yeah, I mean, essentially what we see in this proposal is that the Sea Alaska Corporation has asked for a rewriting of the rules, sort of a do-over when it comes to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. There were areas that were identified under the Act from within which Sea Alaska could make selections, and essentially they've gotten to a point where they want to change those parameters, and instead of making selections in the areas that were agreed upon previously, they want to make selections in areas pretty much throughout the entire forest. In fact, one of the more troubling aspects of this proposal is that not only would they be making selections for timber purposes, but they've also identified a whole scores of smaller parcels scattered throughout the entire forest that would be for other purposes, development purposes. So instead of it being a somewhat contiguous area that would be selected, it would actually involve the transfer of scores of little places, which are some of the most valued places, little coves and headlands and places that are of great value and of importance to the public who uses those same areas for recreation or hunting or subsistence. So it's really, it's generated a lot of controversy within the Tongass forest region-wide, and even while the numbers of acres that we're talking about in total do not seem that large, when you take that selection volume and you slice it and dice it and you put it into little pieces and you scatter it throughout the entire forest, the impacts that would result from the proposed transfer are disproportionately great.
It's like buckshot.
Buckshot.
They're cherry picking, really, looking for really good recreation spots and timber spots, and And there's nothing. And another thing is that it's entirely unprecedented within the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act for this kind of proposal to come forward. Essentially, it is of concern. Both the Bureau of Land Management and the Department of Agriculture, the federal agencies that have responsibility for these conveyances, have objected. In part because of the precedent it would set, because there could be certain other Native corporations that may have a small amount of unsatisfied entitlement that could look again and say, well, maybe we would like to slice and dice and have selections in the Chugach National Forest or other places, essentially going outside and rewriting this legislation, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which was a very difficult piece of legislation that balanced a lot of interests, and now Sea Alaska is saying we just unilaterally want to rewrite the rules. And I guess it would also be important to point out that as an organization, Audobon recognizes the validity of satisfying
the entitlement that Sea Alaska is due under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, but right now they have the ability to make selections, and they could do that and be done with it without anybody else's permission. But what they've decided to do instead is to go back to Congress and say, we want to rewrite the rules because we want to be able to make alternative selections, and those have engendered a lot of controversy among communities, among subsistence, commercial fishing interests.
Well, let's talk about that when we come back. We're going to take a break. And, you know, there really isn't a way to say, really sorry, we bought you out of the back of Russia's van, even though they stole you. And so we need to make all these you know, we get that. But this is something different. And this is actually creating a discussion, I think, that is really interesting about Alaska Native corporations versus Alaska Native tribes versus what's best for the state, and trying to balance those. So we'll be right back in just a couple minutes. Welcome back to More Up North. I'm Shannon Moore, and I'm really glad our panel, Eric Meyers, Dr. John Schoen, and Matt Zencey are all here with us talking about the Tongass. And it's right before we went to the break, there was this whole idea of Alaska Native corporations. I think there are some real misunderstandings about Alaska Native corporations. They are not the same as tribes. Just ask the people in the tribes. They are corporations. Their job is to make money. They are asking to go in and get the most amount of money for the corporation that they can. There's nothing Alaska Native about that. It's just about the corporation, from my way of thinking. So what's their alternative? I mean, what would we say for them to do instead of being able to go in and just say, I'll take that, oh, that looks pretty good too?
If I may, one of the things that a number of Native corporations have done, although it has proven a little bit controversial in the lower 48, is to move into government contracting, because they can make arrangements under Section 8A of the Small Business Administration Act to partner with larger corporations.
Like Blackwater.
Well, okay. I'm not necessarily saying this.
Which, by the way, BP just changed their name to Blackwater. It's not taken anymore because Blackwater is now Z. Anyway.
Well, there are a number of Native corporations that have gone very heavily into government contracting through the 8A contracting preference for Indian and Native American entities, and are generating hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue. Now, it raises its own controversies, obviously, but there's another track that other corporations have pursued and have done quite well at.
So what do you think they should? You think they should just stay the hell out of the forest?
No. Sea Alaska has tried to diversify with investments in the lower 48. You know, there's a one or two handful of the smaller Native village corporations that essentially just became financial holding companies. They just put their money into the bank and treated it as an endowment and manage it that way. Not necessarily saying that's the best thing for a regional corporation to do, but you want a diversified economy or diversified base for your business, which is what Sea Alaska is trying to do. But they're trying to make one last run at really good timber before they do it, and it's controversial because there's not that much left, and everybody treasures it for different reasons. And if there's not that much left, and they've already had a pretty good helping of it, you got to ask, why do you get more?
There are some potential scenarios that would allow Sea Alaska to make additional selections, and the question is where those selections might be. There are some lower conflict areas that have been previously logged and have certain infrastructure that don't have the highest resource values in terms of fisheries and wildlife habitat. And there has been a lot of work to identify these what you might call low conflict areas. They may not be as profitable as some of the areas that Sea Alaska wants, but I think that's really the question that comes down, when it comes right down to, is what's the appropriate balance between the private interests of this corporation and the public interest that everyone has as a member of our or as a citizen of our country, because this is the national forest, and it is widely regarded as the crown jewel of the national forest system. So that balance is really what we're talking about more than anything else. To this point, See Alaska has, it seems like, identified areas which have extremely profitable attributes and is sticking to it for the most part.
So maybe you don't always get what you want. Should be a theme here. Although it seems that they've got Murkowski and Begich both on their side right now, which bothers me. Dr. Schoen, I want to ask you about places in the Tongass or in Prince of Wales that, right?
That's right.
It's on, okay, I'm just making sure. So that have already been logged. It's like, do they go in and plant more trees and maybe in 600 years we'll have some big fatties again? I mean, because that's what we're talking about. I mean, I was just in the Sitka forests with the totem forest, and it was just like being in a cathedral. It was just, I just didn't even want to take a breath. They're just magnificent, and they're everywhere, and they're huge, and I hugged one, and it felt good. But